Good morning and welcome to the Workforce Observer. We are so pleased to have with us today Jon Kesman, a procurement executive who has driven results for companies globally in many of the complex indirect spend categories, forging functional business partnerships to develop and implement effective and much admired procurement strategies. Welcome, Jon.
Hi, Subhadra. Thanks for having me.
One of the things I've been meaning to ask you, and this is my opportunity, your perspective as a buyer, how do you evaluate procurement services? And let's first start by you defining what you think of as procurement services.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, semantics is very important. If it's a sort of a campaign I've been on for a long time, when the industry talks about procurement services procurement, statement of work, SOW management, all those different things, I think it means lots of different things to different people, and I think that's been one of the impediments to more progress in the space from a managed spend perspective. So, I think in the context of what you're asking, procurement services is how does a service provider provide sort of that BPO type service to an organization? So, like, how does an MSP provide SOW management services to an organization? Is that kind of, when you say procurement services, is that sort of the lens through which you're looking?
Yeah, so no, I go back and forth, but yes,
Yeah.
that would be one lens.
Yeah.
So you said BPO and then you said MSP.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
explain.
Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah. So I guess the MSP being the managed service provider, all the players that are out there in the market. I think when we talk about procurement services or the management of services spend within that context, it can often be more of a BPO, an outsourced process type of a relationship and solution, because you're talking about procurement processes, you're talking about contract work, statements of work, obviously, and the associated payment mechanisms and settlement that goes with that. So sort of they're not the same, and I recognize that very much that they're not the same, but I think some of the activities involved in the way MSPs can successfully manage that spend have a little bit of a BPO flavor to them.
Well, that's interesting. So the MSP, so one example would be the MSPs here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Just one example, using people, say, offshore, maybe Philippines, maybe India, and working for a client, which could be a global client or could be also be headquartered in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Right?
yeah, and I think it's interesting. The BPO term is often synonymous with offshore and lower cost and those
Yes.
kinds of things.
Yes.
But I do
Yes.
believe that in the case of managing services spend and the way that we talk about procurement services, depending on the complexity and the level of maturity that the organization is doing that, I think that it's important to consider the level of services being provided to the end user. I mean, you and I both know that there's resistance. There still isn't a significant adoption in this space of procurement services, as we've termed it. And I think part of that is down to the way that the user interfaces, the end user interfaces with the function, whether that's owned by the internal procurement organization or whether that's outsourced to another third party to manage, kind of for them. So, not that offshoring carries with it sort of any problems. It's just more of the white glove service that's often required to work with managers that have high complex service requirements, the supply base, the contract structure, those kinds of things that have to really fall in line well for it to be an effective service. But you still have to deliver it at a low cost, or a cost that's got some sort of an equilibrium to it in terms of what's being delivered and the value being received. So it's always a constant conversation around what's the best model, where do you do it, how do you charge for it? Because I think one of the biggest challenges that the service providers have in this space is there's an expectation that it's free or it's next to nothing to cost wise, and I don't think that's fair, but I also think that that's the pressure that they're under. So how do you do it cheaply and effectively to get customers to kind of buy into it and let them kind of have you take that on for them?
And I mean, you said complex service requirements.
Mm-hmm.
Give me an example of what you mean by, or two examples of what you mean by a complex service requirement.
I think just sort of in comparing and contrasting, I guess this procurement services space was born out of traditional staff aug MSP contingent workforce, the sort of the traditional model of that. And, it was sort of recognized, well, it's all labor, so why can't we just do that part too? And anything that's on an SOW, we bring that in, and it's the same. Well, it's not the same, because you have huge, strategic global organizations that are providing complex consulting work, multi-year projects, with significant strategic impact to the organization, that it's a little bit more complex than saying, hey, I need a couple of business analysts and developers on an hourly rate. And this is more of we're going to go hire a strategic IT consulting company to implement a global system for the next 3 years. So that's sort of those are extremes, I suppose, but that's kind of what I mean.
Right, so somewhere between like very complex strategic sort of agreements and, of course, staff aug.
Mm-hmm.
There's a
and
whole
there's everything in
bandwidth,
between.
yeah.
Sure, yeah, it doesn't have to be one or the other. But when I talk about the complexity of those, it's the manager that has that requirement, or the executive that has that requirement to deliver that implementation to the business. There's going to be some reluctance to let go some of the controls and reins of that, and so that's where I think you get a little bit of the rub.
So where do you think suppliers often miss the mark? And I'm again talking about staffing suppliers.
Yeah, you mean in the provision of those procurement services, as we've been talking about them.
Yeah.
I think part of it is in not fully recognizing that there is a difference. It's a gamut of sort of complexity, and sort of saying, well, we run the MSP today, and we've got a bunch of staff aug contractors running through there. We can easily just bolt on SOW, and it'll work the same. Everything flows the same. I think that's a mistake. I think most organizations know that, but again, it gets back to sort of this: you've been almost kind of pigeonholed into a mode of delivering and a cost point at which you must provide that prohibits you from doing anything but that. So I think that's part of it. I also think that the recognition that you have multiple stakeholders in this proposition, right? I mean, workforce managers, HR, TA, certainly will have interest in the workforce piece of it and the talent strategy piece of it. But, in almost every case that I've seen, and probably every case that I've seen, procurement is a massive stakeholder with responsibility for the way that this process works. So I think part of the problem that many organizations have is you position it as a workforce solution, and you ignore the fact that procurement, as big and complex as that organization might be, owns every bit of the process associated with the way that those services are acquired. So you can't go at one angle and say this is a workforce solution and ignore the complexity of procurement, nor can you go towards a procurement solution and ignore the importance of the TA piece. So I think making sure that connectivity is there in the way that it's being sold and positioned and ultimately managed is really critical.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about your role at AssuredPartners, and where do you think, what's the current state of sourcing? What's working? What needs to evolve?
Yeah. So I've been, as we've known each other for a long time. I've been in procurement roles in different flavors for my whole career. My role here is new. I just joined at the end of 24, so I don't have a full assessment of the organization, I guess, specifically. But more broadly speaking,
Sure.
I think sourcing as a function has certainly come a very long way. I think that it still remains, though, in many cases, viewed as a tactical piece of a process. So I've seen a lot of organizations that say, well, we're going to bring sourcing into this, and the sourcing person's role is to simply take the deal that's 90% of the way already baked and put some finishing touches on it, try to negotiate a little bit better, and then stamp it for approval. So I think there's still a lot of opportunity for sourcing as a function to play a bigger role in the way that suppliers are chosen, the way that supplier partnerships are managed. Certainly that the value is managed and extracted the right way from those deals. But at the same time, there is a more strategic seat at the table that's happening across procurement and sourcing. And I really think the technology has evolved and continues to come a long way in helping with that, so that it's not, I've seen a lot of organizations where sourcing is seen as, oh, you're going to make me run an RFP that's going to take 3 months, and you're going to make me use that old antiquated tool, and I don't want to do that, and therefore the thing kind of falls apart and crumbles. Technology has gotten much better, as everybody knows, to be able to make that transaction much faster, much more efficient, much more user friendly in terms of the person that's got the requirement, the end user. So I think successful sourcing organizations and sourcing professionals embrace those pieces of evolution and incorporate it into what they're doing to make it a much more meaningful and positive experience for everybody.
Well, since you introduced technology, let's go to the technology. So do you think buyers are fully leveraging and embracing tech in today's workforce solutions? And how do you see tech, including AI, shaping procurement and talent acquisition?
That's a great question. Gosh, I spent about the last 8 years working at an MSP, and before that, in many different roles, owning contingent workforce as a category, as a program, and all the associated technology. I believe that the VMS technology, sort of at the forefront of that, have come such a long way and have so many great capabilities to be able to be effective in the way that this kind of whole pie is being managed.
Right.
But I don't believe that organizations are using these tools to the maximum potential. And it's a lot of reasons. Some of it's organizational, some of it is technological, some of it is nobody really knows why. There's often what you see is there's been such significant investment in money and change management and organization around putting in large procurement tools that are sort of broad brush, can do kind of a little bit of everything for all spend. And then you start talking about point solutions like a VMS that's going to be more focused on certain functions, certain categories, and what it can do for that. And I think there's sometimes an aversion to embracing those because of, it's another tool and we're already paying to put that spend through this tool. Why would we do it in that tool? And some of that business case and the value prop gets a little bit, sort of, I think, muddied. So I think the tools are there. I think the capabilities are certainly there. And with the development of AI and all the things that continue to kind of amaze us every day, there is potential. But I think that's just one of the battles that procurement people are continuously fighting is how do we get the most out of the systems we have? And when we recognize that there's a deficiency and tool A does not have it, but tool B does, how do we get the organizational support and the funding to pivot to that, integrate it, or whatever we need to do to make sure that we're using the best of everything that's out there to extract the value?
Yeah, there's a lot going on, I guess. It's complicated.
And I think,
So
I was just going to say too,
Yeah.
and I think with AI, it's interesting because, as everybody, the cliche now is, well, AI is everywhere and everybody's always talking about AI. It's true. And there's AI that does some really cool things, and there's tools that I've seen and been working with over the years that are really, really sort of the wow factor is there. Wow, I can't believe that it's doing that for me that quickly. And so I think as organizations continue to get better at that and bring that forward in the way that it can actually solve a problem or be inserted into a business process, and more of the trepidation of people using those tools because they become less afraid of, well, that's going to actually do my job for me, so I don't want to embrace it because then it's going to push me out of a job. I think a lot of that's still going to shake out in the years to come, but we're certainly seeing the rapid advancement of all of that.
So today, as a buyer, what are your two biggest challenges you face in this, in the ecosystem of ours?
Yeah. I think, well, there's only two. Come on, that's what we're limited to two. I guess it's a short podcast. I think
It is.
I think you continue to, personally, in what I've seen with other organizations as well, is you struggle with, again, this alignment of internal stakeholders. We've talked for years about executive buy-in and sponsorship and all of that, and that's all critical. That's not changed at all. But as I alluded to earlier, I think you have so many cooks in the kitchen and so many hands in the pots, so to speak, that you've got finance, you've got IT, you've got HR, you've got procurement, you've got all of these players that are critical to decisions that are being made around how workforce is managed and how it's being bought and acquired and the suppliers to which those are coming in and all of that. That it's a huge challenge, and it's easy to say, well, get some executive sponsorship and everything will be fine. That's not true. I mean, we know it, you know it. Everybody knows that you can only get so much sponsorship, and there's lots of other politics involved. There's lots of other things that influence the way that stakeholders can have a say in how things are done. So I think that's a challenge that it continues.
Right.
And I also think that that data, we've been talking for years about data. I really believe that, and I've seen this on both the buy side and sort of the sell side, the service provider side. Data and what do you do with data is so critical. We spent some time when I worked at Allegis working with Bruce Morton, who I know you know well, and I think you had him on the podcast not long ago.
Yes.
We talked a lot about so what and then what. You have all this data, and it's got to mean something. Running reports and doing all these things to just say, hey, now we've got all this data, but not really knowing how to use that. That's a really good
point. That's a really good point. Yeah.
It's a huge opportunity, right? Because to say, well, now we've got all this visibility, but not really knowing what do you do about it or do with it is really, you haven't gotten any further, right? It's just more of the data dump, and you're not buried by even more of it now. So I think that's really critical too, is being able to say, here's the business problems that we have, finding a way to get the data that's needed to try to solve those problems, and then ultimately knowing what to do with it once you've got it. Take it to the business, take it to your supply base, change your strategy of how you source or bring, talent strategies, whatever they might be. I think that's really critical pieces.
For a long time, and I know you know this because we've spoken about this, we talked about, so who owns this? Is it HR? Is it procurement? TA was really not something we talked about. It was really HR or procurement. And I know that a few years, sometime back, it shifted again to where procurement, they're saying, owns it. Yeah. Do you think it does not make it easier if procurement is in charge of suppliers, talent acquisition, or at least, they are on top of the funnel?
Yeah.
Does it make it easier, or no, not really?
Well, I guess selfishly being a procurement person, I would say, yeah, that's where it belongs. But I think that often procurement gets bogged down with too many other things that are priorities for the business. And this is a complex area, and it takes lots of focus and investment and time to get it right. And I think that sometimes, because procurement is responsible for so much and there's spend all over the place, that it can often not really get the full attention that it needs. Whereas if HR owns it, sometimes HR's got a bigger voice, and they can, say, we're talking about workforce and how do we make sure we have the right people, and sort of that whole talent strategy becomes, kind of a big piece that can drive a lot of things forward. So, I alluded to it earlier. I don't think it's one or the other. I think it can truly only be successful if it's both. And I haven't seen a ton of organizations that have it shared sort of equally, or kind of even somewhat equally. And but I really think that in order for a full labor talent strategy that has / procurement strategy to be effective, you need to kind of have both executives out in front of that.
Well, that's a good answer. You've gone back and forth between being a buyer and a supplier, more than once. Multiple times, I would say, right?
Yeah.
What does it take to navigate this transition, and what have you learned from both sides? I think it would be really helpful to know.
It's a great question. I think there's probably something in there about the grass feeling greener on one side or the other, and it kind of leads to sort of this back and forth. I've spent my total career, I've spent more time on a service provider or seller side, whether that be a consultant, as with an MSP or other. So more of the time there. I think what I've often found, when I'm in a service provider role, you kind of get exposed to all this great thought leadership and best practices and all the different, the art of the possible. And then you sort of have this desire to go and apply it in a place where you can do it and then own it and run it. And, that's sort of been the appeal to go do that. But then in a lot of organizations, you kind of get stuck and you say, well, we're either not willing to go that far and do all that great stuff, or you get, other things get piled on, and that's not the focus of the business. And so a level of frustration that says, well, I'm going to go back and get back into that innovation and go talk to other companies about how to do this right. So that's sort of been the back and forth for me anyway of why I've found appeal on both sides. How do you do it successfully? I think part of it is just recognizing that, if you're going to go try to do these things in a buying organization, there will be limits. I've seen, if I had to guess, Subhadra, I've seen 200 organizations, Fortune 500 companies, smaller ones, that have some procurement problem to solve for which there are a multitude of solutions. And the receptivity, the openness, the ability to take those solutions and put them into these huge organizations, really, really challenging and difficult. And there are some innovators out there. There are some that are willing to do some of these things. But at the end of the day, corporate bureaucracy exists everywhere, and it gets really difficult sometimes to get some of these things in place. So knowing that pick your opportunities where you'll have some pushback, but you still can find some of the rewards from doing those things successfully. And then on the on the supplier side, being able to take the environment, the challenges, the problems that are arising, and saying, hey, this is what is happening in the real world. How do I, as a supplier or a person working for this solution provider, solve for those things? So I think there's a lot of power and value in that, because you have the credibility, you've done it, you've seen it, you've managed it, you know what works and what doesn't, and now you can go do that, as a solution provider or a supplier to do it for other organizations. So for me, that's been a little bit of the back and forth over the years.
I guess it's almost like I would think that on the provider side, you could really develop thinking, leadership, innovation, but it could just be in a vacuum because it's only academic till someone actually takes it and does it.
Right.
So for a provider to be able to do it, they need the client.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Well, I mean, the age-old question of a buyer is, give me 3 references. Let me talk to 3 people that you've done this for. And in my experience, a lot of service providers say, well, it's either new and innovative. So let's take AI as a process or a solution built around AI. Tell me 3 clients that you've done that for. Well, I don't have them because it's new and it's innovative, and that's why we're talking. But I can't give you 3 clients that have done it yet because the system just came out last year, kind of thing. So you sort of have a little bit of that challenge where it's do you want to be on the leading edge of this? We can make it work. We'll put service provisions in place that say we'll make it work, but you can't get stuck in that old way of thinking of, well, if you haven't done it for 10 years for somebody, then I'm not interested to take that risk.
And this is true even of providers who've been in business forever, very well established. So so challenging. So that's why I guess in a weird sort of way startups work. Yeah. Because they can come in and do something and say, we don't have any customers, but here we are. Till someone bites.
100%. Yeah, and you see some of these, technology maps that are out there now, and there's so many of these point solutions, and there's so many of the different, consulting companies that do things that are really fresh and innovative. But you have, again, sort of this, even great leaders at the executive ranks in lots of companies are just a little bit kind of handcuffed by their ability and sort of willing to take that leap sometimes because they know that there's lots of other things that could be holding them back. So it's that art of the possible is something that people talk about. I mean, we've been at conferences before, right? You get in these workshops. What's the art of the possible? And you do all these great things, and the whiteboard starts huge with all this great stuff on there, and then over time it just gets sort of skinny down to, well, let's just start here and see what happens in 2 years. And so I think you got to be willing to sort of go a little bit further.
Jump in. So what would it take for buyers and suppliers to collaborate more effectively? I hear both sides, and there's always some sort of I wouldn't say clash, but it takes a lot to get 2 people on the same page. Yeah. Especially when one has, I would say, a little bit more power than the other. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. Yeah. Go ahead.
What's the disconnect, I guess?
I personally think that sometimes it's just a philosophical view to how you treat the buyer-supplier relationship. So I've been in procurement my whole career. I was at procurement major in school at Michigan State, and early days you're taught this combative, the supplier, you got to go into the negotiations, and like the first trainings I ever took as a corporate buyer was how to negotiate with your supplier, and it was all around getting the price down and creating sort of this adversarial thing. Now I think a lot of that's changed over the years, but I think a lot of it's just philosophical. You have to be open to partnership first to understand how can I leverage the best of what you have to offer, and how can I trust that you're going to have my best interest in mind as a client to help me solve these things in a way that we're both getting equal value out of. So that's way easier said than done, because
of course,
everybody's measured on something, and if I'm measured on cost savings, then I'm going to hammer you on cost savings, and if you're measured on revenue, then you're going to try to sell me as much stuff as you can. So it's a delicate balance for sure, but I think it has to start with just recognizing those opportunities where there's a business problem that exists that needs to be solved, and where you as a supplier can come in and help me, number one, understand it, recognize it, and build solutions around it, even if you haven't done it in 20 other places before. And me as a buyer being willing to put my guard down a little bit and recognize that I can't do it all myself. I don't have the staff, I don't have the resources, I don't have the money. I need to lean on external partnerships. And that's really the way that look across the organization, like with IT. IT leverages third-party relationships all over the place because they need the help, whether it's expertise, technologically, capacity, resource, whatever it might be. So I think that it starts with that collaboration. Partnership is critical, and that's how I think successful long-term relationships can be built and managed.
I mean, I had a supplier tell me that it's hard because, for instance, say someone's worked with you for many years, right? And you're a buyer here, and you move jobs.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not true of you, but for most people, they bring their suppliers along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They're like, oh, I work with X, we can do an RFP or whatever, request for proposal, but I know these guys,
Happens everywhere.
So it becomes hard, It becomes hard for a newcomer who probably has something to offer to get it. How does, I mean, it's always, how do you stand out?
Yeah, I honestly wish I had a great answer for that. Over the years, I couldn't count the number of solicitations that I've gotten from staffing companies that have great credentials, that want to get into a program, that want to become part of the supply base, and that's just not really how it works. Unfortunately, everybody kind of knows that, right? I think having a really good, if you're going to outsource your workforce program to an MSP, I think having a really strong supply management program within that MSP is important, because they'll know what do you have as a client, what needs aren't being fulfilled, where are suppliers falling short, and they'll have that large view to the market across all those clients to know suppliers with certain specialties, suppliers with certain quality and delivery capabilities. As a supplier, to be honest, I know it's frustrating, trying to get in there. Hey, could you take a 10-minute call with me? I can tell you about what we do. There isn't a great answer to how to crack that nut. I think if I had it, I'd probably be doing something different. But I also think too, one of the things that I've seen, back to the technology piece, is the way that AI can match capabilities with requirements is something that I've been pretty impressed by. Where if you're a supplier, you don't have to necessarily be a supplier for that company to be able to be recognized. It's sort of in some ways like looking up the old phone book and saying, well, who does this stuff? The AI brings together the requirement with the capability, and I've sort of used this term before, but you have trusted partnerships, you have these supplier relationships that might be really well ingrained, but there could be somebody sort of in the garage developing that next really cool thing that you don't want to ignore. So having a way to bring those things forward and get visibility and access to those is important. There isn't one way to do it. I think there's lots of different ways. You kind of have to keep exploring. And again, it comes down to those relationships. I mean, your point of, if you move jobs, you take the relationships with you. That's just the way business works, I'm afraid. And I think that, again, some of these things will help with that. But the last point I want to make on that, which I think is a really important one, and it kind of brings a lot of what we've talked about together, the data piece of it, right? Because you can say, hey, I've used that supplier before and they're great. Well, that's why are they great? What have they done? Oh, they've always delivered for me. All of that's really sort of subjective, and I think
Right.
the ability to have the data, and this comes back to using VMS and tools and other things, to say, here's why they're good, here's why they're delivering, and here's the quantitative proof that says that. I think that's absolutely critical. So as a buying organization, if you want to justify your supplier relationships, that's the accountability piece, to be able to prove it and say they're really good, or actually they're not, let's go find somebody else that is, as opposed to just this feeling of, well, I know so-and-so that works there and they've done this work for us before and we're getting a great price, just trust me. I think having more accountability to ask the questions of kind of prove it, so that as a buying organization you could go find those other suppliers that could maybe be doing it a little bit better. I think that's a really important piece.
Okay, that's great. Where is the world of work heading? What do you think? Where is it going?
It's hard to say, isn't it? I mean, I think when we initially
Yeah.
talked about this, you were talking about, what does the future look like? I think it probably depends on what we define as the future, right? Is that, is that by the end of 2025? Is that 5 years from now? Is it,
Oh my God.
Right? I mean, you think about, you and I have known each other for probably 20 years now. The things
Yes.
we talked about back then, what's changed since then, given all the predictions that we heard from that point? It's sort of I don't know. I think
Not much, actually.
Well, right, yeah, exactly, and
Kind of scary, but yeah.
it is, and I remember going to conferences and talking about these things around, in 5 years, 60% of the workforce is going to be contingent, and 10 years on, and all these things that are going to be happening,
Yeah.
and I don't know, maybe some of it's come true, some of it certainly has, but we talk about things like total talent, universal workforce is the term that we used at Allegis, and it was one of these things where, again, back to a reference for Bruce Morton, deconstruct the work, and how do we figure out, do you need a contractor, do you need a full-time, do you need a consultant, and
Right.
do you let technology do some of this? That potential is there. The service providers that are out there, the technology that enables some of that stuff, it's all there. I think one of the biggest impediments to progress in this space, and why we haven't seen massive growth and all this stuff that we predicted 20 years ago, is back to some of what I talked about. That reluctance of organizations to take those leaps. The conservative view that a lot of organizations take about how this stuff is done has really been a limiting factor in the progress of it. So I think the future of work probably looks like we've talked about. It'll be one of those things where here it all is for you. You can go and do it this way. Are you willing to? And those organizations that, I suppose it's like with anything, if you're willing to embrace the innovation, and if you're willing to embrace sort of the risk that it might take to do it better and cheaper and faster and all that, it's there for you to do, but you may not choose to do it. So, it's a great question. I think that there's a lot smarter people than me that can talk about talent strategy and where it's going. I think from a procurement perspective, as I alluded to earlier, ensuring that procurement as a function is aligned well with HR and what HR is doing from a talent perspective, and then also well integrated in the other parts of the business that are forming strategy and figuring out where the company goes from that strategic perspective, is the critical piece to make sure that whatever the direction that the future of work goes, that as an organization you can compete and stay up on the war for talent and getting the people that you need to be able to advance the company's mission.
Great. Okay. Any takeaway? As a buyer, do you have takeaways for one piece of advice for other buyers? I mean, you've done both sides, so
Yeah. I
maybe
think.
you have.
Yeah. Well, so this might be a little bit of repetition based on what we've talked about here, but I think probably the one biggest lesson as a buyer would be to, one, take a really hard look in the mirror and understand what you're good at, where the gaps might be, and not be afraid to embrace the solutions that are out there. As whether that's a service provider that can do things with you, for you, whether that's technology that might be a little bit different than what you've got today, or vastly different for that matter. You can't be afraid to go out of your comfort zone in that way. And then I think as a service provider or supplier in this space, it's being comfortable asking some of those hard questions of a buyer or someone that's exploring. Can you do these things, and can you do them well? And if you can't, then here's how we can support that. And I think, I've been harping on this for years. It's back to the data. As a provider,
Right.
whether that's a piece of technology, whether that's an MSP or some other type of service provider, data is so important in all ways to drive decisions, to get investment, and those kinds of things. So I think the focus there around using data, showing how you can put data forward as an enabling tool, is a critical piece for success in this space.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Really enjoyed our conversation. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Subhadra.